Record the webinar. Okay, so welcome to the second Mussar webinar for this year. The topic is generosity, nedivut. I want to start by taking a look at the agenda. We're going to look at the themes of the topic. We're going to go through the different texts, and then we'll finish up with some supplemental materials. Okay, so this Mussar topic, generosity, nedivut, it corresponds to the standard October Chai Mitzvah topic, tzedakah. So we're going to do some comparison between tzedakah and generosity. I think that a good place to begin the discussion of this topic is talking about the Hebrew word for generosity, nedivut, which has the root nun dalet vet, which has to do with willingness. In contemporary Hebrew, the word for volunteer is mitnadev. From the same root. So let's take a look at the themes. First of all, we're comparing to tzedakah. Unlike tzedakah, which is a Jewish obligation based on justice, generosity comes from an open and willing heart, going beyond the minimum the justice might require financially or emotionally. And the other theme is that generosity can be expressed in many ways. Okay. I see, Meredith, that you're saying you have tzedakah on your booklets. You may be doing the standard Chai Mitzvah. This is the Mussar that corresponds to it. That's what I'm actually going to be talking about, but it can actually relate to what you're doing. So maybe we should have a discussion. And we can see there's also a webinar on the standard topics, and I will send you a link to that as well. But I'm going to keep going here about generosity because that will relate to what you're studying anyhow. So, so we're going to look now at the three kinds of generosity. First, a word about the source of this text. It's Orchot Tzadikim, which is a book of Jewish ethical teachings that was composed in Germany during the Middle Ages and was originally named Sefer Hamidot by its author, whose author is anonymous. Nobody knows who wrote it. Orchot Tzadikim includes teachings from Rambam and others. The work advocates improving one's character and exercising balance in one's life. So let's look at the text. There are three kinds of generosity: generosity with money, generosity with one's deeds, and generosity with one's wisdom. And all three are found in Abraham. So this elicits a couple of thoughts. What do you think is meant by being generous with one's deeds and with one's wisdom? And Meredith, since you're doing tzedakah, you might also relate this to tzedakah in that people think of tzedakah a lot of times as donating money. But of course, your time and your wisdom are also forms of tzedakah. Again, the difference between the two, really between generosity and tzedakah, is that tzedakah is justice. It's what you should be doing. And generosity goes beyond that. So we're going to think about our own capacity for generosity. And do you think you're more generous in one area than another with your deeds, your wisdom, or your money? And a nice way to study this in depth, each person has 2 minutes to answer the following questions. The reason I think it's easier for me to be generous with blank is that blank. For example, the reason it's easier for me to be generous with deeds is that I have a lot of time and less money, something like that. They can fill in however it works. It's harder for me to be generous with blank because blank. So after the participants do this, let them break up into different groups. Those who think they're more generous with sharing money, with deeds, and with wisdom. And when you're finished, you'll come back together in a group and discuss. And end with this question. Mussar is a very hopeful Jewish spiritual practice in that it believes we can cultivate these character traits. What's one practice you could commit to that would help you cultivate generosity in a new and deeper way? And when we talk later about Abraham, you'll see how this relates as well. This also might be a good time for participants to think about the social action projects they're planning for the year. So remember that there are questions on the back cover of the booklet to help focus them on their projects through the lens of the monthly topic. So the questions for the Mussar topic of generosity are: how has your text study about generosity, nedivut, informed your thoughts on your social action project? And how has your text study about generosity informed your thoughts and actions with regards to your other independent projects? So that's what you'll be discussing. And now it also says that all three are found in Abraham when we go back to our texts. So what does that mean? There's a midrash that you might share with your group. It says, tzedakah was slumbering, and Abraham aroused it. How did he do it? He built an inn with openings in every direction, and he would receive wayfarers. That's kind of a symbol for he would welcome people in and he would teach them about tzedakah, for example, or about generosity, I'm sorry. The explanation is this. Abraham excelled in all three categories of generosity. He used his wealth to accommodate travelers. He risked his own physical safety to rescue his nephew Lot, who had been kidnapped. That's a deed. And with his wisdom, he brought the word of God to a world of paganism, sharing his monotheistic vision with the world. So that accounts for 3 of the doors to Abraham's inn. But the inn had 4 entrances, 1 in each direction. Abraham went beyond the 3 dimensions of giving we've discussed. He gave to others in every important way, and that way he attained the 4th dimension of giving, which is he himself was imbued with the trait of giving. He was not just a person who gave, he was in essence a giver. And that's what we're studying when we study mussar and our own character traits. The 4th entrance was because Abraham exemplified what it means to be generous, and that represents the perfection of personality that Abraham achieved and that we, his descendants, strive for by studying generosity through mussar. I read somewhere that if you go to sleep thinking about a way you can be generous, you are beginning to become a generous person, not just to do generous deeds. So that's an interesting thing to look at. Are you doing things that are generous, or do you feel generous? That's something you might want to discuss. Okay, so let's look at the next text. Okay, well, actually, before that, for more to discuss more of this, there are 3 kinds of generosity. Sort your thoughts and discuss in which category of generosity you think each of these acts belong. And you see here on the screen, there are 8 of them listed. Engaging in volunteer work, sharing a secret family recipe, forgiving someone who has wronged you, tutoring a child who needs help at school, giving advice to a friend in need, donating unused toys, books, or clothes, raising money to participate in a dance-a-thon, offering to do an errand for a neighbor. These things show different kinds of generosity, and you can help focus your participants by looking at this list and then thinking about which are easier for you, and then thinking about how these can actually become part of your character. So that's what we need to think about before we do go on to the next text. Okay, a willing heart. The Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel that they take for me an offering. From every person whose heart makes him willing, you are to take my offering." Okay, so let's think about that for a minute. The word yedvenu, you see, is underlined here. That's from the same root, nun dalet bet, and you are to take my offering. In other words, you have to be willing to give. It introduces God's invitation to the Israelites through Moses to donate their belongings to make the tabernacle. God didn't want donations that were forced. God wanted only willing hearts to give. And when the story continues in Exodus 36, it turns out that the Israelites donate so much that Moses has to call a halt to the donations. We've seen similar overwhelming generous responses after catastrophic events around the world, for example, earthquakes, tsunamis, the current hurricanes. So you can ask your participants, has everyone in the group ever been moved to give to excess? And what motivates the desire to give? The Torah text teaches that the donations to the creation of the tabernacle were not to be mandatory. The tabernacle had to be created only from the donations of willing hearts, not hardened or begrudging hearts. So this type of giving demands a purity of motive. For personal reflection, think about times when you gave grudgingly rather than willingly. And have you ever acted out of purity of motive? I think that especially nowadays, there is a lot of generosity because we have a lot. It's interesting to think about what motivates people to give. And that brings me to Rambam's ladder of tzedakah, which probably many people are familiar with already. If you'd like to have this graphic, let me know and I can send it to you. It actually has the steps of Rambam's ladder, and you can kind of cut them out and put them in order for yourself. One of the things it stresses is that giving before being asked is a higher form of tzedakah. And so if you talk about generosity, giving willingly is a higher form. Being generous is a higher form of tzedakah. If you like this visual, I can include it in the follow-up. And if you use it, remember to point out that this ladder refers to laws about tzedakah, but that nedivut is different in the ways we've discussed. It's generosity. It's not required of you. Our tradition also recognizes that there are ulterior motives for giving. Therefore, the highest honor is reserved for those who are in a chevra kadisha, the volunteer group that prepares a dead body for burial and guards it. This is the most honored volunteer position because it can't be done for motives like being paid or thanked, because the dead can't repay one who's done them a kindness. And so without judgment or self-criticism, recall a time you were generous in order to receive something in return, whether praise, honor, money, a recommendation. I think it's also important to point out here that charities understand that people are motivated to give because it makes them feel important and in some way powerful. You know, they'll put your name on a wall or on a brick, or they'll put your name in an ad journal. That's not terrible. You're still giving. It's still better to give than not to give. We're relating how giving relates to generosity right now, but it's also good to acknowledge that you don't have to only be a perfect, generous person. Giving is still very good. So we have to remember that as well. And let's look at the text again, a willing heart. Okay. Another interesting part of this text is the use of the word take when it actually means give. Yikhu, which you see I underlined here, means to take. They take from me an offering. So what does that mean? Why does it say take instead of give? Well, Rabbi David of Kutsk suggested the following way to think about it. A folk saying states that a fool gives and a wise person takes. This refers to a person who gives tzedakah. A fool who gives tzedakah thinks he or she is giving, while a wise person who gives realizes that he or she is taking. He or she is the one who benefits most by the action. So sometimes when you give, you get so much in return that you actually feel like you've gotten. So think about when your own act of giving to another actually has been a gift to yourself, when you've received more than you've given. The next text is Don't Be Stingy. It's from Cheshbon HaNefesh, which means a reckoning of the soul. And it was written about 200 years ago by Rabbi Mendel Menachem Lethin of Satanov, which is in the Ukraine. It offers step-by-step approach to the character development and refinement. So what this text says is, accustom yourself to finding satisfaction and acting kindly towards others, and in seeing the meanness of being stingy. Okay, what does this mean if we look at it and take it apart? It reminds us that we want to grow our capacity for generosity. The wording accustom yourself reminds us that practice makes perfect. There are some practices suggested in this session, which we'll examine later, to help us cultivate the midah of generosity. It's also important to acknowledge that we're all stingy at times, whether with our time, our money, or our emotions. And sometimes doing so is actually important self-preservation. Understanding our motivation for acting in a certain way is part of one's spiritual curriculum for mussar. A midah actually translates as a measure. Each of us has a different makeup of midot in our personalities. Some of us are more generous, some are more stingy, some are more or less patient, more or less forgiving. Both generosity and stinginess are part of the same continuum, and both are called midot. The goal of mussar practice is to find the right balance between the two, the right measure. So you can be too generous, just like you can be too stingy. The art on this slide you might recognize is from the book The Giving Tree by Shel Silverstein. And if you remember the story, the tree gives until there's nothing left. And according to mussar practice, that would be not considered a good measure of generosity. You're not supposed to give so much that you have nothing left. So let's talk about some of the practices we can do to cultivate generosity. One of the practices is to focus on both generosity and stinginess and find the correct balance. If it works with your group, have participants fill out something like this, keep a journal, and share the next time they're together. You see, it says commit to doing at least 3 generous acts each day. Write about the 3 generous acts you accomplish each day in your generosity journal. Also, write about one situation each day where you weren't as generous as you might have been. Next, try to improve on that behavior. If you like, you can share what you've written at the next session. So it doesn't mean that you can't ever be stingy. It means that you have to find a balance. Here are some other practices. Shabbat sharing. It's traditional to give tzedakah before Friday night candle lighting. And Meredith, when you talk about tzedakah, you might also introduce this practice. It's also an optimal time to be generous with what you share with your family. Tell them what you've appreciated about them. Share something you've learned during the past week. Another practice is midah meditation. Sometimes an image or bodily stance is a helpful tool to cultivate a midah. As a meditation for this midah, you can either visualize this or you can do it yourself. Open hands, held up and out in an act of generosity. So what I was thinking about, because of the idea of finding the perfect balance, you can kind of open them to give and close them to take and go back and forth and think about the right measure for you, what feels right. So that's a nice thing you can do that's almost like a yoga. It's using your body to help you think. And then the next one, generous example. So you can journal about what your parents modeled for you about generosity when you were young. Were they generous with money, with deeds, with wisdom, with all 3? And has their example influenced the way you interact with others, either to be similar to them or to be different from them? But how have they influenced you? And now here are some links to additional information that are very interesting. The first one, Generosity Week is a program of the Mussar Institute and usually coincides with Parshat Truma, the Torah portion that contains a section we read earlier about donating to the creation of the tabernacle. So for 6 consecutive days, the Mussar Institute will send emails or videos to help us each cultivate the midah of generosity. And if you go to this link, you can sign up for it. Another additional info, a Jewish fable claims that the location of the temple in Jerusalem was chosen because of an act of great generosity between 2 brothers and took place there. Okay, there's a version of the story that you can find at this link. And in case you don't remember it, I'll share it with you so that you might want to share it with your group. 4,000 years ago, 2 brothers lived near each other on a hill in Jerusalem. They each had their own farm, but they shared a threshing floor. Every year, they would bring the harvest and divide it equally between them. Then they would take the grain to their farms and sell it in the marketplace. One of the brothers was wealthy but had no family. The other had a family but was poor. One night, after the harvest had been divided into equal measures and taken to each brother's home, the wealthy brother lay awake in his bed thinking, I need just enough grain to pay for my food and servants, but my poor brother, he has so many mouths to feed. He needs the money more than I do. He rose up out of his bed and went down to his granary. He lifted up as many sacks as he could carry and started to walk towards his brother's farm. Just around that time, the poor brother was lying in his bed, unable to sleep. I have a wife and children who will take care of me and the farm if anything happens to me. But my poor brother, if something happens to him, he will have to pay to be cared for. He needs the money more than I do. Quietly, so as not to disturb his wife and children, he rose up out of his bed and tiptoed down to his granary. He lifted up as many sacks as he could carry and walked towards his brother's farm. The 2 brothers met midway between their farms, their arms laden with the sacks of grain they were carrying to each other. The full moon shone down upon them as they smiled, as they dropped their bundles and ran to embrace each other. God looked down and said, "This is where I shall build my temple." So that's a great story. And then there's another story that you can see here. Um, it's in Talmud Tani 24a, and it's about a tzedakah collector who tries to hide from an overly generous rabbi who's willing to donate his daughter's dowry. And this is to help you think about if you know anyone who is generous almost to a fault. I know someone who, for no reason, asked people to live with her who were not similarly inclined. But anyway, I'm going to read this story to you because there's not a link to it. And if you'd like me to send it to you, just respond to my follow-up email. The Gemara cites stories about miracles that occurred to righteous individuals. Whenever the charity collectors would see Elazar of the village of Berta, they would hide from him. As any money Elazar had with him, he would give them, and they did not want to take all his property. One day, Elazar went to the market to purchase what he needed for his daughter's dowry. The charity collectors saw him and hid from him. He ran after them, saying to them, "I will adjure you, tell me, in what mitzvah are you engaged?" They said to him, "We're collecting money for the wedding of an orphan boy and an orphan girl." He said to them, "I swear by the temple service that they take precedence over my daughter." He took everything he had with him and gave it to them. He was left with a single dinar, which he bought himself wheat, and then ascended to his house and threw it into the granary. Elazar's wife came and said to her daughter, "What has your father brought?" She said to her mother, "Whatever he brought, he threw into the granary." She went to the open door of the granary and saw that the granary was full of wheat, so much that it was coming out through the doorknob, and the door would not open due to the wheat. The granary had miraculously been completely filled. Elazar's daughter went to the study hall and said to her father, "Come and see what He who loves you, the Almighty, has performed for you." He said to her, "I swear by the temple service, as far as you are concerned, this wheat is to be consecrated property, and you have a share in it only as one of the poor Jews." He said this because he did not want to benefit from a miracle. So you can see that this person was very generous and did not even want to benefit from the miracle that was given to him because he was generous. So this takes two things. It talks about giving actually being receiving, and it talks about the midah of generosity, how generous you should be to be in the right measure. And that could be a very interesting discussion for your group as well. And then there are some supplemental materials that you can also get at these links. The Natalie Merchant song, "Kind and Generous." If you listen to the words, it's very nice, and you can think who you'd want to send this to in your life. There's a TED Talk. Adam Grant talks about, are you a giver or a taker? He says, and it's a nice one. I just watched it. He's interesting. He's a little bit funny, and he's interesting to listen to. In every workplace, there are three basic kinds of people: givers, takers, and matchers. Organizational psychologist Adam Grant breaks down these personalities and offers simple strategies to promote a culture of generosity and keep self-serving employees from taking more than their share. And then the next supplemental material is an Eli talk. It's called Social Intelligence, and it's from the Foundation for Jewish Living. It talks about how important social intelligence is to us. And it's a foundational Jewish value. So Rona Novick investigates why we teach our youngest children social intelligence skills, such as empathy at school and at home. It's also a very interesting Eli talk. And then the last one, Lamed Vavniks, the hidden 36 individuals who live among us in every generation. It's a really nice essay from Rabbi Zburin. It's interesting too, because it doesn't just talk about these people who are so important to the world, but how knowing about them would influence how we look at our friends and family. So that's also a really good supplemental material. This is a time if anybody has a question. Meredith, I know you have to type. I'd be happy to answer. And if there are no questions, then I will end the webinar. Okay, so thank you very much for joining, and I will send out a follow-up email, and we'll talk again next time. Thank you.